There's only one element to Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 that doesn't translate amazingly well to a UK audience. And that's telling people to look something up in the program, because over here, programs aren't complimentary. So over here, it just looks like inbuilt advertising in the musical for your programs. To be fair, this is a great program. A lot of great information. I highly rate it. Cast your mind back to 2017. It was an interesting year, but it was a great year for theatre over on Broadway, and it was the year that I was most invested with Broadway and the Tony Awards. I really want to get back engaged with Broadway and speak more about Broadway content on the channel next year. But back in 2017, Little Ellie was just obsessed. They had one of their best seasons, and the 4 Best New Musical nominees were Groundhog Day, Come From Away, Dear Evan Hansen, and Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. And all of these we have slowly started to see come over to the UK. Obviously, Groundhog Day is the one outlier here as it started in the UK, but even so, it has returned since going off to Broadway. Come From Away came over next and was phenomenal. Dear Evan Hansen has not only had one production over here, it's had 2 unique productions, with a brand new revival currently touring the UK. And the last one we were waiting for was Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, and I must say, my hopes for this coming over were a little bit weaker. It had a little bit of a tumultuous time on Broadway, which led to a sad early closure. But now, the Donmar Warehouse has produced a production of Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, led by their brand new artistic director, Tim Shearder. So now that we have got every single Best Musical nominee from the 2017 Tony Awards over in London, what do I think of this very different production of The Great Comet? Let's find out. But if you haven't seen my face before, hi, I'm Ellie. I talk about theatre. I am the most chaotic theatre person on the internet. I do reviews, I do discussions, I do versus brackets and rankings, and if any of that sounds interesting to you, please consider hitting like or subscribe. It really helps me, it helps out the channel. But let's dive in to Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. Am I going to be saying this title in full for the entire video? Probably. Now, before I speak about the production itself, I want to dedicate quite a bit of time speaking about this musical, because I firmly believe that Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 is one of the best musicals written in the past decade. The reason that my intro focused so heavily on the 2017 Tony Awards because that year was wild. Every single one of those 4 musicals could have won Best Musical in a different year. And honestly, a lot of people don't even believe that the one that won should have won. I think it speaks a lot about the quality of the musicals that year, that all of them were phenomenal, and this is no exception. This is an absolutely beautiful, heartbreaking, heartwarming piece of theatre. It's so interesting, especially when it comes to adaptation, because this is based on War and Peace. Not the entirety of it though. Dave Malloy took 70 pages of War and Peace, a tiny section, and adapted it into this musical. And despite only being based on about 5% of War and Peace, that is a very long book, I will tell you that right now, it still feels like a very complete story. As it contrasts the 2 titular characters, Natasha, her innocence, her naivety, and her fall from grace, and Pierre, his depression, nihilism, and his eventual rise to finding his purpose and a little bit of hope in life. These 2 character journeys are balanced through the plot of this musical beautifully. And because it's dedicating all this time to such a short section of the book, it can really dwell in these characters, dwell in these moments, and provides a really thorough exploration of these people during this period of war, and the love and loss that comes with that. Now, this is a sung-free musical where the music is a very important element, so a lot of my discussions on the story of this musical are going to be done within that. But I must say, it's a really fantastic choice in adaptation. The section they take works amazingly well on stage, and throughout the entire musical there is only one moment of spoken dialogue, and the bit that they choose gives that such a impact, especially when you know what happens after this in War and Peace, when you have like a more wider knowledge of the entire story. That moment and the importance of that moment is really given weight in the way that Dave Malloy writes this show and structures it. But yes, let's speak about the music, because yeah, 99% of this story, 99% of this musical is the music. And oh my god, it is gorgeous. You could write video essays. Like, you could spend hours and hours and hours analyzing all of the little intricacies of this score, all of the motifs, all of the reprises, all of the ideas and the themes that Dave Malloy just bakes in there. It is a gift of a score. And if I was smart enough, I would be analyzing it so thoroughly, but I'm not. It just immediately teleports you to 19th century Russia. It's so full, especially in a space like Donmar. This music just absolutely soars. And it's so unique because of the way that it's written, because of the way that it's structured without rhyme, allowing a lot of these soliloquies and these moments to just flow. There's so many great songs in here. The prologue is so interesting. It sets up all of these characters. It firmly sets itself into the direct address and the style of this musical, and takes that moment to get you used to it, while also introducing you to all of these different characters that you're going to meet throughout the musical, with this charming, almost call and response style of setting them up. This chain, almost like a memory game, one by one introducing themselves with an adjective and a characteristic that is deeply associated with them. Whether that be that they're young, that they're beautiful, that they're a slut. And it leads so beautifully into Pierre's introduction. One of my favorite numbers in this whole show. We have that moment of joy. We have that moment of really lively, upbeat music introducing all these characters, and that is suddenly completely flipped on its head as we get a sense of Pierre's mental state at this point. He feels useless, he feels pointless. His friend is out fighting in a war, and he's stuck at home. All he can do is drink and study. He wants that purpose in life, he wants a need, and he just doesn't have that. There's so much relatability in that. There's so much in there. And the way this dialogue is crafted nails that completely. Screaming out, I'm different than you. I'm different than you. I still want to do something. Or even the opening of it, it's dawned on me suddenly and for no obvious reason that I can't go on living as I am. This discontentedness of Pierre in this number perfectly introduces you to exactly who he is and exactly his wants and his struggles. Then we go into a number like Moscow, which is so wonderful. I love this number. I love the melody of it as well. There's probably a better word for it, but it's very Russian to me. It's the ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba. And I love the relationship this builds between the family members, between Natasha, Sonia, and Maria, introducing you to that family dynamic and what it's like when Natasha and Sonia are visiting. The status quo and a lot of the really important elements you need to know. And this lovely reunion and the warmth of it is immediately contrasted with how they introduce the Bokonskis. This droning low note, the shakiness of the delivery of that dialogue. It's very uniform in a way, which shows almost like an entrapment of sorts, especially when it comes to Mary's dialogue here. These characters only show up for a little bit of the musical, but there's such an impact from what they present. The harshness as Prince Bukowski, and how that visually deeply affects Mary. It's so well represented and portrayed through the music of this song. And it even takes these little moments, these little things, these inconveniences that wouldn't be epic or horrific, and makes them feel so deeply uncomfortable. There is a moment in this number where Prince Bukowski loses his glasses and just everything falls apart in this moment. He's screaming, he is screeching at the top of his lungs. All of the instruments, the orchestra are going absolutely mad. It's unhinged. and it leaves a pit in your stomach as he becomes more and more panicked and frustrated, only for the rug to be pulled out from underneath you when Mary turns around and just says, "They're there upon his head." It shows exactly who these characters are. These characters were only in the musical for like 2 songs, but there's so much deep character development through these numbers. It's so genius. Because at the end of the day, Prince Wiskowski puts on a big act. He's harsh, he's rude, he's awful, but at the end of the day, he's just a scared old man who's kind of losing himself a little bit. And you see the effect that his attitude has on Mary, and also in the next song, his attitude and the effect that it has on Natasha. No One Else as well, a beautiful number. Some really interesting ideas done with the staging of this number as well in this production, which I'll speak about a little bit later. But this number shows you the innocence of Natasha, gives you an exploration of her love and who she is as a character. It's really beautiful, really, really beautiful stuff. And I also like how Pierre also gets a similar moment, a similar soliloquy, a little bit later into the musical with Dust and Ashes. After this moment of conflict, Pierre reflects on his life, reflects on his place, reflects on all of these things. It is this beautiful journey of a soliloquy. It's gorgeous. One of my favorite numbers in the entire musical. Now, Helene, especially in this production, is one of my favorite characters. And I think that is absolutely down to a song like Charming. Charming is so good. Obviously, a lot of the numbers in this musical don't lend themselves amazingly well to like listening to them out of context. It's not a traditional musical in that sense, but Charming is one of the ones I feel like you can do that with. I love the refrain of the chorus, the "oh, how she blushes, my pretty," the charm, for lack of a better word, that Helene puts on. And the manipulation, it's so interesting to watch, and it's a brilliant song. In Act 2, we get a song like Letters. This contrast again between Natasha and Pierre, both writing to the same person with very different goals in mind. Natasha completely struggling to even put down a single word, and Pierre continuing to speak about the war, the want to be there, the want to do something. A number that I wasn't really enamored by before, but really loved in this version was Sonia Alone. An absolutely heartbreaking moment. And then we go into something like, well, I'm just going to call it the entire abduction sequence. So that's going from preparation to Balaga to the actual abduction song, which I'll speak about a little bit when it comes to how they stage it, because I wanted a lot more of this production to do what they did with this number throughout. Because there's an absolute explosion on stage. The energy completely shifts. And I love the ups and downs of this number. You get the absolutely gorgeous Goodbye My Moonlight Lover section, having this almost like drinking song vibe. You get the joy and the fun, because, you know, Balaga is just for fun, of a number like Balaga. There's so much life in this entire sequence. It's really, really good. I love how In My House is a complete contrast to a number like Moscow earlier in Act 1. This moment of anger and frustration. Maria barely even being able to structure a cohesive sentence, just being full of rage. Bringing up all these ideas like, what am I to tell your father? What, you doing this in my house? I can't believe you're doing this in my house. Almost like a stream of consciousness coming out as she's realizing how huge and how dangerous for their reputation this whole situation is, and how offended Maria is that Natasha would dare to do this in her house. And this musical culminates in a beautiful number, The Great Comet of 1812. So full of hope. It takes a lot of the motifs from Pierre to round out his journey, to show how he has changed as a character and found his focus and his purpose, and how much he's changed as a man. This score is gorgeous. There's no better word for it. It's fantastic from beginning to end. There's so much in there. It's such a well-crafted show. Now, that is my opinion on this musical. I think the musical itself is a 5-star show. I think it is phenomenal. I think it is one of the best crafted pieces of musical theatre that we have seen in a very long time. I wanted all of that to be addressed before I speak about this production, because I do have quite a few hang-ups on this production. I think the first thing I need to say very openly is that I have a deep love for that original Broadway production. I have a lot of love for that approach and what they did and the set design, the costumes, and making a Broadway theatre feel immersive. There was phenomenal work done there, and this production is very different. What I will say is this is not the first time that Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 has been in a small space like the Donmar warehouse. Off-Broadway, they literally did this production around like little cabaret tables. The action just happening and easing its way around you. This has always been a very immersive piece of theatre. I just don't know if they used the Donmar as effectively as maybe they could with this production. I'll start with some of the things I like, because I think it has to be appreciated that Tim Shearer's direction on Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 is very different to the approach that Rachel Chavkin took. This is a much darker production, and I mean that quite literally. If you compare the color scheme of this to the Broadway, you'll notice immediately a shift. We've gone from the yellows and the reds and like the luscious lavishness of the Broadway to something a lot darker. And I must say, despite my love for that original production, I do think stripping it back does work quite well for the most part. And there are some really interesting ideas of direction from Tim Shearer in here. I think one of the greatest ideas he brings is the dolls. At certain moments throughout the musical, these two Russian dolls will walk out, one in an army uniform and one in a wedding dress. These are very clearly meant to resemble Natasha and Andre. And these two figures come out at key moments in the musical to speak on and show the relationship. The first time we see them is during Moscow. There is a moment in the song Moscow where Natasha reflects on her relationship with Andre, and she screams out like, "Andre, where are you? I want him now at once, to embrace him and cling to him. No one can understand. I want him." She longs for his return, and that's reflected with these two dolls. This dance they do together, and Natasha pulling away the wedding dress doll so that she can dance with the Russian army doll. We also see in moments where the relationship is starting to fracture, where she's starting to fall in love more with Anatole. We see these two dolls kind of break away from each other. There's some really interesting ideas where they thread it through this story, and it's a nice visual representation of that relationship. It's a good idea. I also, while I don't love how modern it looks, I also like the idea of the bear. During Moscow, when Natasha enters, she wheels in a suitcase with this tiny little bear on it, and then during No One Else, she performs most of the number lying on this bear. I will keep the size and the arrival of this bear secret because it's actually quite a fun moment, and I feel like it's quite nice to go into that without spoilers. I'm quite glad that that wasn't spoiled for me. But this bear reflects a lot the innocence of Natasha. It makes her seem quite young as well, and I think it really reflects that. And we see this come up again when she's kind of at her lowest in Act 2, when she sees herself as fallen, when she's struggling so much, feeling and thinking that her life is completely over because of what she's done. She kind of reverts to that. A really interesting pinpoint, even if I don't like the design of the prop itself, a really interesting way to show that and reflect that. What I don't really love is how empty this space often feels. It's such a small space that it's weird how empty it feels throughout this musical. A lot of the moments are done on a very bare and empty stage. And yes, the music does soar and does feel a lot of it, but it is a shame that visually this show is quite bare at times. I think the best moments are during moments like the preparation, like the abduction, like Balaga. When the space completely comes to life, when they bring in these crates that they push around, these little props that they bring on really do build up this space a bit more. And when they're properly interacting with the audience and making the audience feel a part of it, I feel like it clicks. I think this is something that's coming from straying a little bit too far away from the original version, because that original version was immersive. The reason why that stage on Broadway was made as it was because they wanted you to be immersed with this musical. So cast members on Broadway could go from the back of the stage all the way to the back of the upper tier. I can't remember what they're called on Broadway. The orchestra is the down bit, and that would be, it's not the grand circle, that's what we call it here. The the balcony. I guess they call it the balcony, don't they? I don't know what it's actually called in the Imperial, but they can go right to the back of the balcony and all of these like active musicians playing the score, going round. You feel a part of it. And it's strange because even though I'm in a very small space, I didn't really feel a part of a lot of the action in this production, which I think is a big part of Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. This production does it in certain elements with the direct address, but I don't feel like that was enough. And I missed a lot of those immersive elements. Where they do come in is during the abduction. Anatole and Borger all messing around and speaking to people in the audience, giving them drinks. That makes you feel a part of the action, a part of this story. And I feel like that was what I was missing throughout a lot of this musical and a lot of this production. Something that was a lot more baked into the previous version. I feel like it's such a big part of the lifeblood of this musical that it's one change that I definitely struggled with a bit more. I'm trying for the most part not to compare it to that original version. I want to treat it as it is. It's unique and its own production. But I do think that is such a part of the blood of this musical that it is a shame that it's not as seen throughout this production. But ultimately, there's a lot of really great ideas in this direction I did really appreciate, and a lot of it, including the design, feels like it's going for that much darker edge. Let's speak a little bit about the set, because obviously it is very dark, and if you see pictures from before the show starts, it's quite dark, but the giant Moscow sign at the back and the windows at the bottom do provide different colours throughout the numbers. We get a purple during Charming, we get a lot of reds. This curtain at the back adds a little pop of red onto the set as well. I actually quite enjoy this set design. And this balcony overlooking it that sometimes the characters will step down from by sliding down a pole, which honestly looks very fun. Very, very fun. I love the central light, this ring of lights that raises up at the start of the show and can also come down for certain moments. It creates the opera box during the opera, obviously, and also provides seating at different points. And obviously when it's up, provides a lot of interesting lighting choices as well. And they make good use of the lights throughout the audience of the Donmar, these creating the Comet of 1812. It's the costumes I have more of a problem with, because while everything else feels quite in line with the time period, the costumes are weirdly modern. I do really miss the lavish costumes from Broadway. Gone are a lot of the fur coats literally referenced within the text of the piece. I don't love a lot of the more casual outfits for Natasha, Anatole, and Sonia, but I do quite enjoy Cat Simmons' dress, and certain costumes for Pierre feel quite in line with what he would wear. And honestly, the best moments of costuming are when they feel a bit more in the time period. My favourite literally being Mary's dress. I will say, despite me not really loving Evie Gurney's more modern costumes, I do quite like the contrast that this brings with a character like Mary, actually. Because she's in more of a period dress, because she's in more of like a traditional dress, it actually gives a lot of contrast between her and all the characters in this musical, underlining that idea of her being more oppressed, being more trapped. See, this is moments during theatre that I really love. Taking an idea where I'm generally like, I don't really think this works, but there's like an interesting approach that you've taken here with it. It allows me to appreciate the ideas and the approach that these creators are taking. While I would generally have wanted, and after watching it still would have wanted, a more traditional sense of costuming, I don't think we could have just taken the Broadway costumes and put them onto this production, because it's a very different production tonally. But I think they probably could have taken a lot of the shape of those costumes from Broadway and just changed the colour scheme, made it darker, played with the deeper greens and blacks and greys and browns. Because I do think on the whole, despite it being a very unique musical, it does feel very suited to that time period. It does feel very suited to that. So I don't really think the modern approach to it works as well here, as maybe it would do with some other musicals. But what I will say is completely phenomenal is this cast. Declan Bennett as Pierre, fantastic. He explores this deeply complex character with so much grace. His portrayal is so strong. Vocally, he's fantastic. He is the real backbone to this musical. Shamisa Dunford-May as Natasha is wonderful. I love the journey she takes this character on, really showing an authentic innocence to her. Jane Moscato is really suited to the role of Anatole. I like how weaselly he makes him in places. You never quite trust him thanks to that portrayal, and vocally he is really strong. Kat Simmons, I think, is one of the key highlights out of this cast. She has a slightly smaller role in the role of Helene, but oh my god, she is perfect for it. Her seductive nature, the way she holds herself on stage, she has so much status and power. Utterly fantastic and one of the key highlights in this entire cast. And that's being said of a cast that are already all at the highest caliber. mwmheps as Sonia is such a deeply moving portrayal. I think her performance of Sonia alone is so deeply moving, a performance I will never forget. And then there's Daniel Krickler as Dolokhov. Dolokhov in the musical is self-described as someone who's not too important, but he's important to me. And also, I know Anatole is meant to be the hot one, but well. Honestly saying that, all of the supporting roles in this musical are phenomenal. Annette McLaughlin has so many iconic moments. The fury of a moment like In My House is so well portrayed. Then there's Eugene McCoy playing both the older prince and Andre. Two very different characters here. And while it's very over-exaggerated, the portrayal of the older Bakonsky, there's a lot of weight and groundedness to his portrayal of that. And he's paired really well against Chloe Sarako as Mary, so shy and meager and meek. And then obviously Cedric Neal as Balaga, he's just for fun, and fun he has. He makes Balaga into a spectacle. It's so good. While it's obvious that I do have my hang-ups about this production, on the whole, this is a very strong production of Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. They do a lot of justice to this music, to this story, and there's loads of really great ideas in Tim Shearer's direction. It's a much darker approach than I'm used to, and there are elements from the Broadway version that I do feel like would have been justified to bring over into this one. But nonetheless, if you have been waiting as long as I have for a production of Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, I don't think you'll be let down by the production at Donmar. But what do you think? Have you seen this production? Did you see it in New York? Let me know all your thoughts on this musical in the comments down below. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me, it helps out the channel. Here's some links to some other videos on screen right now and a link to my Instagram if you'd like to drop me a follow over there. As I have other social links and a merch store in the description down below. But that's it for me today, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!